and salutations, our fine podcast audience. Welcome to 3 Peas in a Pod, episode 266.
We made it.
We made it back. We had a little break.
We did.
We took a week off because we ain't got nothing to say.
That's true. And we had some vacations in the midst.
Stuff happens.
Yeah.
We did. But this episode, if for those of you who were paying attention on Sunday, just a couple of days ago.
Hot off the
This is very hot.
proverbial press.
Because Nathan put us out on a limb and said we would have this episode. So I have to be here.
He knew there was a question.
I
He
saw the
made
question.
me come in here and film this.
I said, this has to happen or
Mhm.
don't come into work tomorrow. Of course,
which I
you
could have
don't-
thrown a wrench into your plan and said, no, Nathan, I'm not doing
That's
this.
true. I mean, that's and you don't work it physically in this office on Tuesdays anyway. So
True.
That threat did not work.
But I'm here.
You are here.
I'm happy to be here because I want to answer this question because I know it's a big question for a lot of people.
It is.
You touched
It's
on it.
certainly for this person.
Of course. And you touched on it Sunday, but
I did.
we're going to go into it a little more in depth. My guess is there's a lot of podcasts, a lot of stuff on the internet that's talked about this. So
Yeah.
ours will not be the greatest nor be the most comprehensive, but this is what we got.
Nor, and I think this is important before we get to it, the final word on this issue.
No.
No, this is going to be one of those where we talk through it, and there's going to be a lot of I don't knows
Mhm.
and a lot of this is what we think. And
And this is how we wrestle with some of these.
That's
Sure.
probably not going to be my final word either, because I will say on this particular question, in 40 years of following Jesus, my answer is different today than it was,
mine is as well.
It means you're growing in.
or not.
Or I've gotten dumber on this issue.
Let's
I've
hope
gone a
not.
different direction.
I hope I'm getting better. I hope I'm getting more like Jesus.
I hope so.
that's what
I
I
hope
So here we go. Here's the question for today. So, what is the deal with all the violence in the Old Testament? Was God using Israel to show the world that he would destroy anyone who stands against him or his people? And why was God okay with putting to death Israelites who stepped outside of the law? So, violence in the Old Testament, it's there.
There is some.
It's a lot of it. It's a
There's
violent culture, the Old Testament.
I was gonna say,
written
there-
in.
would also say there's violence in the New Testament. It's
Well,
just not talked about openly,
Mhm.
but they're under severe persecution
That's right.
all the time. There are
Mhm.
Christians being beaten behind the verses
All
all the time.
That's true.
That's right.
That's true.
Yep.
And I will say, I think there's not as much as sometimes we think there is. There is a lot,
Mhm.
but I think sometimes, at least I certainly grew up with a feeling of it's like every other verse is just someone getting killed and someone
Mhm.
else doing this. But I've been just in the last 2 years going through the Old Testament with
Mhm.
some believers in a Bible study, and it's there, and there is a lot of it, but
Well,
there are
and
also
most-
large sections where there's none.
Well, and
So-
most of the history, at least in the Old Testament, is the historical record of the military conquests.
Sure.
And so there's going to be a lot in that because that's the prime focus of that historical record.
I would also say that part of the reason my answers to this have changed through the years is I love history. I've always loved history. One time thought about majoring in history. And it's a passion for mine. I study history, read history. You can't read any history that is not more violent when you walk away from our present time. And by that I mean we know that we live in our country the safest time in the history of our country. Now, I know that challenges people that think we're just on the edge of disaster.
Right.
But this is the 1950s, where a lot of people my age somehow want to go back to when we were first born, significantly more violent
Right.
than it is now. The 1930s, significantly more violent. The 1800s, when the Wild West, it was called the Wild West
Yeah.
because it was wild. Everybody had a gun. Turned out it wasn't a good thing. Everybody toted a gun around.
Uh-oh.
And those little towns had their own form of gun control, which was the sheriff got a gun, and the rest of y'all, I'll either kill you with your gun or you can give it to me.
Mhm.
So it turns out they didn't think the Second Amendment gave them rights and everybody had guns.
Right.
And when you get back before the time of Jesus, it would be hard for any 21st century person to be dropped into that time and their first thought not be, this is the most violent,
Yeah.
dog eat dog,
Dangerous.
place that I can possibly imagine. Even some of the countries we know of now that are super dangerous, nothing compared to ancient history, exceptionally dangerous. And a part of my change on that has been that when you read the nation of Israel, I again think, because I follow Jesus, and I think the whole Bible is a story that leads to Jesus, I think God is constantly undoing chaos. That's what's happening throughout the Bible. That even in the beginning, God is over the chaos waters, and he creates out of the chaos. And God is continually undoing chaos. And in the 2,000 years since Jesus, chaos has been significantly constrained in some ways, in that we aren't as violent as we used to be, and that most of us will go through our life and not feel like our life was violently threatened.
Right.
But that was not true for most people in most times in this world. So I think when you read the history of Israel, it is violent.
Sure.
But if you read the history of non-Israel during the same period of time, I think you'll find it was significantly more violent, which is why Israel significantly lost most battles that they fought.
Yeah, in general.
They were not
usually the losers.
They were the losers in almost everything, because the God they served was constantly trying to restrain human nature nature-chaos, which is, I want what I want, and if I have power, I'll use my power to get it through any means. So there is still a lot of violence for a 21st century person.
I think that's a really good historical look at the text, too, to just remind us where this is placed. Because the person who asked the question was using some of the language from our series that we've been in, of that God is using Israel as this kingdom of priests to reveal his character to the world. And the question seems to be, so what part of his character is he revealing with all the violence? And I do think the other part, though, maybe of the series that maybe at this point we haven't emphasized as much as we will towards the end, which is this idea that God is working in a particular time, in a particular place. And he is saying, in this particular context, this is how I'm revealing myself. And what Ed just pointed out is this is a particular time in the history of the world that was exceptionally violent. Not just violent nation against nation, but within tribes.
Oh, yeah.
If you wronged me, there's a story in the Bible of a guy who says, if I get, Lamech is his name, if I get wronged, if God, because God had said at one point, if Cain is wronged, I will curse those who curse him 7 times. And this guy goes, if Cain's going to get avenged 7 times, I'm going to get avenged 7 times 70. I'm going to go after this guy. There was this idea of, you wrong me, you wound my eye, I'm killing your family. I'm killing you. And so even the law of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is God saying the most you can do to somebody.
Well, yeah, the violence you're describing right there we don't even have a category for it, because we see violence on a nation scale in our world. And that's bad enough, of course. But in those days, it was down to the family unit. I mean,
it was clans. It's Hatfields and McCoys is the closest thing Americans.
We have stories of the patriarchs early in the Old Testament raising armies among their families, to defend themselves from the violence that was being wrought on them. And so it was at every level.
That's right.
And I think we think I'm going to be 66 here in a few months, and you look at that and think, I'm telling you, if you'd have told me when I was 20 I'd live to be 66, I would have told you that, oh my God, that's too old for any human to live. But you get to be 66 and you think, well, that's a long time. But that ain't a long time to God. And even generations of people is not a long time. And God is at work to undo the chaos in his creation. And he's not in a hurry. I know we wish he was, but he has to work because he created us this way, he has to woo us into cooperating with what's happening. If he overpowers us, he violates his creation. I mean, could God make us all do everything? Of course that could happen. But he chose in the very beginning to create humans in a way that he decided to not overpower us, to allow us free will. And in a violent culture, he's constantly just restraining.
Well, in the same way that in our culture, most people kind of sit in, I mean, I know super politically divided, but the extremes on both sides of most issues are a little overwhelming, to use some of your language, to most of us. And what I mean is there a way that many of us might go, yeah, there might need to be some police reform on these things. But then when someone comes in and goes, how about no police whatsoever? Most people go, I don't know if I want to live in a world where if something bad happens, no one's going to do it.
You should go give that a shot. There are countries in
Sure.
Africa that don't have any.
Or
why don't you go live there and see how you like it?
Or do we need some immigration reform? I think most people will go, oh yeah, probably with some way whatsoever. And then you go, do you want to live in a world that has zero borders? And people go, well, I don't know if we, everyone's got this kind of whatever extreme in the same way. So I'm taking that to kind of example where most of us would feel it. If God comes into an extremely violent world and goes, under no circumstances are you to even physically restrain another person, they go, I don't know how we exist as a nation.
Well, and we do have an instance where the world gets so bad that God does say, hey, I'm going to start this whole thing over. Mm-hmm. And not long after that, it's before the law is given, but he does say, hey, life for life. Don't kill people. Don't kill people. And pretty quickly, they start,
Yes.
So it's not like God was going, all right, some killing. Okay. You know what I'm saying? He goes, y'all are so violent. I'm just going to start over. And then he's working within free will.
Yeah.
So,
anyway. And so for the purposes of helping the person who asked this question, I think what we want to try and do is, it just goes off of what Ed, you said it in passing in your other answer just a second ago. The important part for you to get at the heart of how to reconcile this question that you've asked us is what we say around here all the time, is reading the Bible as a unified story that leads to Jesus.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And once you begin to do that, it does change how you read every other thing in the scriptures. And I think at the heart of this is, if you can get one thing out of that, is learning how to do that. And what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right? Viewing, and we talk about this a lot, is viewing everything in the scriptures through the lens of Jesus.
So even their presupposition of a question, which was God trying to use Israel to show the world, if you stand against me or my people, I will destroy you. Mm-hmm. I don't know. The way that's phrased seems so harsh to me that I'm assuming you don't think that that's what he was trying to show. But maybe you do. Maybe you think that's what it is.
Well, I take it, but see, I guess I heard it the other way. They do think it's weird. That sounds all right. But then it's weird that God would kill Israelites.
Okay. If he's trying to show this, why would he do this?
Why would he kill them even if they break the law?
Good point. So you hear that thought. The first question I would ask is, does that sound like Jesus? Mm-hmm. Does it sound like Jesus that he goes, anyone who stands against me or my church, right, that'd be his people, I will destroy them. Mm-hmm. Does that sound like Jesus? And if your first thought, or even not your first thought, go read the life of Jesus.
Yep.
And if what you come to is, no, that doesn't sound like Jesus.
And then read the history of the church and all the people who died, and God decided not to destroy the people.
Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, the final book of the New Testament, the Revelation, has this part where there are martyrs around the throne of God. And what they're asking is, how long until you do something about this?
Right.
You're not destroying these people who have destroyed us. Why aren't you, how long? Get at it. Do it. Which could have a part of, there is coming a day where God is going to bring justice against all the wrong that has been done.
Or it could be that God, even in heaven, is having to say to people, that ain't my way.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
that ain't my way.
Sure. But the issue is, where do you see Jesus in the midst of all of this? And if the answer is, well, I don't seem to see Jesus when he's on the cross, destroying everyone who's against him. In fact, he lets them destroy him. I don't see Jesus, when the Pharisees oppose him, destroying them, right? There do seem to be these places where Jesus does have warnings for people, where he says to certain towns who reject him, it's going to be worse for you than, and then he names towns that got destroyed, Sodom and Gomorrah. And he says it's going to be worse for you in those days because you don't turn against me. Or you did not turn to me. But we don't see Jesus do that. There seems to be this character within Jesus, which is very similar to the way Yahweh revealed himself, of being slow to get angry. Mm-hmm. Peter will eventually say God is patient. God does not want to see anyone destroyed. He wants to see everyone come to repentance, which is why, because he would say, you think he's taking a long time. Well, he's not. He's just slow to get angry. So that's not to say that there's not justice coming. It's just God is doing everything he can.
Well, and justice may not look the way we think. We do think, we still in our minds somewhere think eye for eye is justice.
Sure.
I mean, we really think that even when you read the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus says, you've heard this said, but I say.
Right.
That's right. And he says, pray for your enemies. Justice may not look, I tend to now think, I've been a Christian a long time, God's been very just to me. But, you know what I'm saying?
But
that's not true. He hasn't punished me for the sins that Jesus took.
But isn't it true that even when we participate in what we believe is justice in this world, there's something about that does have an effect on our souls. Mm. It's like, I think in terms of a lot of people in our world, I think most people in our world think there's a place for the death penalty at some point. Mm. There's something that people can do, whether it be murder, or some people would say, abusing children or things of that nature, where it's justified for us to take a life. But yet, when we do mete out that type of justice in our justice system, they protect human beings so that they, like, back in the days when they do the firing squad, they would say, one of you has blanks.
Yeah, all of you have blanks except one.
That's right. That's what they do. Or nowadays, when they press a button, for a gas chamber, an electric chair, or whatever means they're using, nobody knows which one actually caused the death of this person, because we know there's something about it that we know it does damage to the human nature, to human psyche, to participate in even what we would call justice in that sense. So I think, to back what you were saying of how God is constantly trying to restrain, I think God, if anybody knows that's true, it's God.
Yes.
Yeah. And he is trying to move us to a better way. And I think that's the whole thrust of where Jesus is going with his ethical teaching.
Which is why you get in the New Testament where it's repeated, vengeance is, it comes from the Old Testament, but it's repeated. Vengeance belongs to God.
We leave it to him.
Whatever is just, God will do. And that's what I even when it comes to heaven and hell and those kind of decisions, I've had many people through the years come to me and say, hey, I'm really concerned. So-and-so, my friend, they died. I don't know where they stood with God. How can I feel? I said, what you know for sure is God has done and will do everything he can to do the absolute best for your friend that can possibly be done.
Yeah.
Whatever is the best that your friend can have, God will do what is best for them that he can do.
Yeah. And I think if you start with who is Jesus, the basics of who I know Jesus to be from reading the scriptures, not just culturally who I get Jesus to be, because frequently when I sit with people and we're reading through even the life of Jesus, things pop out. One my daughter said the other day, she was reading through, she's 13, and she's every day, part of their Bible reading plan is in a whole year, they read through all 4 Gospels. And so if a kid goes through our plan is, if you go through our student ministry from 6th grade to 12th grade, you'll have read through all the Gospels about 6 or 7 times. And so
more than most adults.
Right.
Yes.
And so they're reading little tiny, what we would call pericopes Little tiny
I
sections
hadn't heard
of
that
scriptures.
since Bible college.
Yeah.
Thanks there.
Passages of
It's
scripture.
a word I had actually forgotten.
There you go.
When he said it, I go,
I'm a
I
little closer to Bible college on this
I
one.
do know that word.
So, but little passages of scripture, right?
Yes.
And in your Bible, they're usually separated with some kind of header.
Paragraphs,
Yeah, header. And
headings.
it's usually the story, right?
That's right.
So she's reading one the other day and she just stops and goes, whoa. And I said, what? She goes, Jesus is aggressive. And I said, well, what was the story? And she tells me, she goes, there's the part where she says, if you cause a little one to stumble, it's better for you that you had a millstone hung around your neck and thrown into the sea. And I thought, you're right. That does sound, because that's not the picture most of us have going, hey, bud, you know, you shouldn't hurt other people. You shouldn't cause other people. And Jesus goes, no, this is, and none of us actually think Jesus goes, I'm hanging millstones around neck.
No.
But we do understand what he's doing is he's speaking. And I told her, I said, he's speaking in what's called a prophetic language here, where he's going, I want you to understand the depths of
That's
this, how terrible this is.
And we don't know, most people don't think of it. But I believe at this point in my life that all the stuff Jason talked about, to be at a place in your life as an adult that you could do damage to a child, your soul is badly damaged. And so it is better for you that you would have been killed than to have that done to your soul.
That's right.
And to the child. I'm not minimizing what,
No,
we tend to only focus on what happened to the child,
right.
the person themselves. And this is a part I think is hard for us to get. God does look in every situation. The person who did violence and the person that had violence, those are both God's children.
Yes.
Something
has gone wrong.
Something has gone wrong, and he wants the best for both of them.
Right. And that's the
hard part for us.
And so when you read these things in the life of Jesus and you go, so you just read them again and again and again, and you get a pretty good picture of who Jesus is. That's where you should start for anybody.
Yes.
If you are wanting to read the Bible for the first time, and I would say this, whether you are a new believer or you've been a believer most of your life, if you have not consistently read the life of Jesus, beyond I read the book of Matthew once, I got what I needed.
Started with that genealogy and said, nope, not for me.
Or I've even read it. I sat down. I mean, I remember when I was in a youth group, I had a youth pastor who said, I bet none of you will read the book of Mark in one sitting. And I said, I'll do it. And I sat and read it. But I've also read the book of Mark a lot more after that, because that one sitting didn't just do it. It's not Harry Potter that I read it one time and I got the story and that's all I needed. So once I've gotten acquainted with who Jesus is, then if you're interested, the Old Testament does point to Jesus. Jesus is fulfilling Old Testament stuff. And there are things in the Old Testament, if I go to it with the question of how does this point to Jesus, it does reveal a little bit to me of not only what's going on in the Old Testament, but about what Jesus is trying to do in the New Testament, what he's active doing in this world. But I have to start with Jesus. That's how Christians read the Bible.
Well, and I would say, and I don't know that I've ever said this, and this may be wrong, so y'all can fix it, as clearly as I'm about to say it. If there are parts of the New Testament that when you read, because the New Testament is the more revealed part.
Yeah.
We're all the way to Jesus now, and then all the rest of the New Testament is just followers of Jesus who followed him closely, helping us learn how to apply with each other what he taught was. So it's in some ways fairly repetitive. But if there's a part of it where you get really confused in the New Testament, you are not ready to go look for the deeper meanings in the Old Testament yet.
Yeah.
You should continue there. And it might be okay for some of you, if you started late in life, that you don't ever get to it.
Yeah.
It is not going to be a question asked on the final.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I know so many people that go to the Old Testament, and because it is more shadowy, there is some really cool things that you find out about Jesus and God's whole way that he was at work. But most of us need some help to see it, including, I've been doing this a long time. And when I read scholars like John Walton, or I read people who spent their life just on the Old Testament, the things they connect for me that I had never, ever, ever knew was there is amazing to me. But if you've been doing it for a short time, and you still don't get all the New Testament, you ain't ready for that.
I agree.
And it will probably mess you up.
Well, and I think what I see happen a lot, and I'm not saying the person who asked this question is there, but they might be. So just take it for what it is. But I've seen a lot of people when they dive into these issues and look at the Old Testament in that way, we get hung up in, okay, this has messed with my conception of God or my thinking about who he is and what he's about. And that's causing me all kinds of, confusion or whatever. And that's, I'm not saying we can't talk about those things, we can't wrestle with those things and they're not important. But at the end of the day, what does that have to do with how I choose or how I am living this life on a day-to-day basis? And that's where Jesus comes in. Mm-hmm. He is our example. I mean, the scriptures even describe Jesus as our brother. Mm-hmm. And I think what they're trying to re-emphasize there is that he is our example to follow.
Yeah.
He's the
firstborn that we're
he's the firstborn among us all. Yeah. And he's the one that leads us in the way of life that he says is true life. And so our job is to put our feet right behind his and walk in his steps. And if there's a passage or several passages of scripture in the Old Testament that are confusing and help us get hung up, okay, we can spend some time with that. But what does that have to do about you personally and how you live out your relationship to anger and vengeance and violence in your own life? Those are two different issues, because this is an account of how God has worked in history, and God gets to do what God does.
That's right.
But for me, what does my life ought to look like? Because I think sometimes if you don't do that separation, I think we can get real wonky on when people do us wrong in life. Well, looks like God took vengeance, or looks like it was okay to fly off in anger, as it looks, the way I'm reading it. But that's why what we've been saying is so important. You got to stick with Jesus, because Jesus has the way.
That's right.
He said, I am the way. Follow me. And so I think that's the most important piece for you. And I'm not saying that's where you are, but ultimately that's where I try to camp out, because that is where the rubber meets the road.
It is.
Well, and that's where I would get to is I think towards the end, and then I do want to try and answer the questions you asked. I know we've kind of been going around some of what might God have been trying to show, but I do want to, this part we've been talking about is the ultimate part of people do get lost in these Old Testament verses. Mm-hmm. And you are trying to, and we've been saying this the whole time in this series, but I think it sometimes gets missed. There are a lot of Christians today that want to copy and paste Old Testament things to where I'm living current. Well, if Israel did it then, Israel can do it now. Or if Israel did it then, I can do it now. Or if this happened then, this is how it's supposed to work now. But very rarely do I meet the Christian who goes, okay, Jesus said, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Let me copy and paste that. That is pretty clear of what I'm supposed to do.
It is.
Let me copy and paste that. Jesus, and there are other things where Jesus says it that look pretty copy and paste to many people, where he'll say to sell your possessions and give it to the poor. We go, well, that can't be a copy and paste. No. Now, I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying that we look at something Jesus says pretty clearly and we go, don't want to do that one. But this one time he said, kill the Midianites. Who are my Midianites? Who could I kill? Because God said, ignoring the context of where that fits. That's so right. I would say anything that is a plain teaching of Jesus, I should go in, as Ed already said, until I'm knocking those out of the park, until I'm knocking out of the park forgiving my enemies, until I'm knocking out of the park looking to the interest of others, as Paul would say, that's a New Testament command, right? Till I'm doing those things well, maybe I don't need, not that I don't read it all Old Testament, but I don't need to be worrying about how do I copy and paste Jericho to my life today.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I was just telling the guys before we recorded, I was just listening to my favorite pastor, Brian Zahn, preach. And I think he just preached this past Sunday. And he said something in his message along those lines. He said, there's a lot of things that you can find in the Bible that do not match with the Spirit of Jesus. And this is true. I mean, and the point he got to at the end of that message where he was talking about this whole issue of reconciling Old Testament violence with the Spirit of Jesus within us. And he said, I think we all just need to spend a whole lot more time when we get in these places where we're struggling with those kinds of wrestling with those issues of where does vengeance fit in, and what does justice really look like? And he said, just sit with Jesus. And he said, if you get to, and it's doing what we just talked about, is spending time in the stories of Jesus and his teaching, and then you sit with him because he is with you, and you talk with him about that and see where he leads you on a particular issue or a particular attitude that you're holding on to. And like you said, who are your Midianites? Or in the case of, the disciples wanted to destroy the Samaritans, and James and John come to Jesus and go, you want us to call down fire on these Samaritans over here? And Jesus goes, this is not how we do things. Who are your Samaritans that you'd like to call down fire on? And you go take that to Jesus. Bring that to him.
Right.
Sit with him on that and see where he leads you.
Well, and you probably ought to, if you get to a place where I was also, earlier we were riding together, and I said that I had just heard a quote of Augustine, or Augustine, depending on how you want to pronounce his name, where he said, any doctrine that we come up with that does not lead me to love God more and love people more is a heretical doctrine.
Amen.
And if you come to a place and you're convinced, okay, God does give me the right to destroy whoever I feel, you probably need to run that by some followers of Jesus who are not as personally affected by whatever you feel like vengeance, and see if they also the Spirit of Jesus.
Yes.
Because if it's leading you to turn away from love of God and love for other people, you're not walking the way of Jesus.
Mm-mm. Well, and we in that same conversation, it's very clear, in John's first epistle, he said, we ought to always be testing the spirits.
Right.
And what he means by that is there's a lot of spirits out there and in me that come up for me. And I should be always putting those in front of Jesus and testing by his standard and saying, Jesus, what is this? And where is this leading me? Is this your way? And that's what that means, is I'm testing at all times what's in me that is not of Jesus, not of his Spirit. I want that gone. I want that cleansed. I want that purified in me, because I want his Spirit to be the lead on everything. And it's pretty clear what Ed just said. It brings me back to love of God and love of neighbor. And that's why I think he tried to make it that simple.
Yeah.
And I would say, when you go back, because if you get really clear on who Jesus is, and you get really clear on how we're supposed to live, because what I would look at too is to say Jesus is revealing the way we are to live in such a way to love God and love neighbor. What that means is God is not bound by the exact thing he shows me on how to live. God is allowed to put out justice the way he chooses to do so. I am the one who has to live under this certain way that he's shown me to live. And so to just sit and say, well, I see God in the Old Testament say this or do this, that means I can do it today. Well, no, Jesus' command to love my enemies, pray for those who persecute me, bless those who curse me. That's how I am to live in such a way to do this. So that's one part. The other part of it, I think, that is really important when I get down to this, is to say, what is it? And this is the question you had. What might God be showing of himself in his relationship to Israel and to the world in this particular time, in this particular context? What does that reveal to me about how I am to love God and love my neighbor, or about what he expects from me? And I would say Jason already brought it up earlier, but I don't know if we were filming when you brought up the story of Elijah.
Yeah, he just
the one we just did.
It was actually before we recorded. I was talking about that. Yeah.
So there's this one story that gets referenced. There are two kinds of violence I tend to see often when I'm reading Old Testament. There are some that is violence that God does not tell people to do. They just do it. There's a time after the golden calf happens, and Moses and them go out and they kill 3,000 people who worship that. But God had never told them to do it. They just, they went and did it.
Yeah.
That was just what they chose to do. So to look and say, well, why did God tell them to do that? We don't know God told them to do that. We just know they did it.
Yeah.
There's a story you brought up of Elijah where people get sent to Elijah.
Yep.
Elijah kills 50 of them.
Well, the king wants to see Elijah. He sends a commander and 50 soldiers, and Elijah calls down fire and burns them up. And the king sends another 50 with another commander. He burns them up too.
Right.
So he's burned up 102 people. And then finally the king sends another regiment of 50, and they just go on their knees and go, man, just don't kill us, dude. Please, just spare our lives. And
Well, because you know, for those guys,
Yeah.
they go, you got to go talk to this guy. They go, well, what happened to the last 50 guys?
That's
You
right.
said to them,
But just
they got burned
die.
up. What happened to the next 50 guys? They got burned up. All right, we got a different strategy, guys.
There's 100 burning corpses right there.
That's right.
That tells me this is not a good idea.
So we're going to try a different strategy.
So they try a different strategy. And in that moment, in this story, an angel appears.
Yeah.
And the first thing the angel says to Elijah is not, hey, good job killing those other ones, but I want you to go with he stops Elijah and says, look, don't be afraid, which tells us that the reason Elijah did that was because he was in fear for his life and he's trying to take matters into his own hands,
Right.
which then calls into question, well, then why would God give him the power to call down fire and then him misuse it? Well, if you think through that just a moment, we have that capability today.
Sure.
All I'm going to say,
Yeah.
just go to the news a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
We have the ability to call down fire from heaven and kill our enemies. Doesn't mean that God condones that necessarily. So he goes with him. And so then the connection is made when James and John get ticked off at some Samaritans that don't receive them well. They reference this story and
Yeah.
they go, Jesus, you want us to call down fire like Elijah did and he burned up his enemies?
Right.
And the point is that James and John missed the point of that story.
Right.
They thought, oh, he had the power to wipe them out. He did. God must be okay with that. They didn't keep reading the story and understand it and so that's why Jesus says, that's not how we do things.
Right.
This is not what God wants for you, because it's not what God wanted Elijah to do either.
Yeah.
Elijah killed some kids because they made fun of his bald head.
Yes.
Did God
That's
want
Elisha.
Elisha?
I just want to make clear.
Elisha, sorry.
Everyone comes
Somebody
in,
was gonna-
comes
they were
in the comments
They were
for
gonna
us.
fact check me on
You
that
go
one.
fact check. It's
Yeah.
Elisha.
Elisha.
Old bald head Elisha.
That's right. He killed some kids because they called him a bald-headed guy.
That's right.
Is
Brings a
that-
bear out.
Did God condone that? No.
Right. Well, and so I think that's one form, which is there is just violence that happens.
That's right.
And that doesn't mean God's going stamp of approval.
Mhm.
That should be happening more often.
Mhm.
That's not what we have. There are other times though where God does say, and he comes to them and says, hey, this army you're against,
Mhm.
those people need to be killed, or destroy this, or destroy this group of people or whatever. Now, on Sunday, if you didn't hear the sermon, I had recently, because when I was researching all of this, read through some stuff and listened to some interviews with John Walton, who Ed already mentioned. And I thought his explanation to me made so much sense, where he's talking about it's not about necessarily wiping out an entire people group as much as it is this kind of ungodly identity. That what he's saying is, because most of the time, once again, as I'll read through it, I read through one this morning where he says, go and destroy the Midianites. Because what had happened was the Israelites previously had been led away from worshiping God because they started to marry these Midianite women. They began worshiping other gods, and that leads to a lot of dangerous practices in Israel. And then they go and they conquer. God lets them conquer Midian. And instead of going and saying, well, then we're going to get rid of all these people from our lands, what they do instead is they go back to the women and they bring the women back. And God goes, you got to destroy these women. Now, whether that means or not physically kill them, whether that means get them away, whatever that means, either way, God's interest is not, I hate Midianites. The issue is, ultimately, there is this way that the people of Israel must live in order to be godly people. And that is similar to several of Jesus's commands of, you should not be living right up next to sin and letting it get right into your life and going, well, God will forgive that and it'll all be fine. There is what I would say, if you ask me, what is God trying to reveal there? God is trying to say, we don't live like the rest of the culture. And so you may at times have to say, once again, not that I go and kill my neighbors who are ungodly neighbors. It is, what do I have to do? Jesus uses this kind of parable of, I may have to pluck out my eye. Now, we know Jesus doesn't mean actually pluck out your eye. What he's saying is, if your eye causes you to sin, you become the kind of person who goes, the eye is not my issue. The issue is me. The issue is there's this thing in me that has to be dealt with. There is this desire in me. I need to bring that before God and ask him to deal with that. So most of, if not all that at least I've encountered, when you look at the God-sanctioned violence, it is not just, God don't like those people and you need to get rid of them. It is almost always, there is this part where God is trying to get us to understand the weight of our sin, the weight of what happens when I bring this in, which we know when Jesus dies on the cross, that's the weight of our sin. It cost the best person to ever live, God himself, his body and blood. And sometimes I think those of us who live on the other side of the cross, we almost treat that very casually. Every week I eat the body and blood of Jesus and I go, well, thank God he forgave me so I can go back and do all the stuff I've been doing this whole time anyway. Next week I'll come back, take some more, and I'll be just fine because he's going to forgive it and it'll all take care of it. Instead of looking and going, there were entire groups of people who lived with God and it cost their life. Their sin cost their life. And God has been so good to me to say, no, it's going to cost my life and it will cost this. And so when I look at that, I go, does that point to Jesus? I would say, yeah, I can see where this points to God's love, because the other part of the thing where they said, why would God say these people have to be stoned to death or put to death? It also violates reading it that way of saying, well, if you commit this sin, you have to be put to death, ignores the fact that there were a multitude of sacrifices that people could make to not be put to death. And there, this group I was reading, we just read it the other day where it says, if a person sins unintentionally, what that means, and we kept trying to figure it out, so we read a couple scholars, and what does that mean? What they ultimately mean is it's not that I accidentally punched someone in the face. It's, I did this, but I didn't make a sacrifice for it. I did not go and say, this is something I need to do, or an act of maybe manslaughter, right? Those kind of things, this accidental thing that happens. It says that person can give a sacrifice and go. It says, but if a person sins with a high hand, and the way we talked about it in ours was in basketball, there are things that are called common fouls, which is I was trying to play the game and do it right, and I bump up against somebody. I broke the rules. I'll take the foul. I'll make the sacrifice. We'll go on. And then there are things that are called flagrant fouls. Mm-hmm. And the way they take a flagrant foul is I raised my hand back. That's usually, was there a windup? Because what that implies was I wasn't even trying to go for the ball. Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to go against this. And they says when you sin with a high hand, that person is going to be put to death. And the way we read that was, because the next story was a person who goes out and picks up sticks on the Sabbath and he gets put to death. And everyone goes, that don't seem like something to get put to death for. But that is an example in their culture of sinning with a high hand, which says, I know what God's told me to do. I just don't care. I don't care. I'm not trying to do what he wants me to do. I'm going to do me, no matter how much harm it causes to anyone else. That is something where I look at it, I go, okay, I can see now there is a difference in these kind of things. The sacrifices are this picture of God's grace and his love to us, of his willingness. And what the book of Hebrews would say is, and Jesus has now made the once and for all sacrifice. None of us have to go and make these sacrifices every time I sin with this fear that God's going to come and get me if I don't. Jesus has made such a way where I now go, I can throw myself on the mercy of Jesus. But maybe some of us should be sitting and going, are there times, because I know God will forgive me, I'm raising up my hand. I'm going, I don't really have to worry about that sin. That little problem I have, it's not a problem for me because God's going to forgive it. I don't need to do anything about it, because what I have experienced in my own life and I've seen in so many people's life, you don't know when your heart gets too hard. It just eventually happens where my hand is raised and it ain't coming back down. And the book of Hebrews would say, we should be warning each other regularly. You're getting a little close to raising your hand too many times, where your heart's getting a little hard, man. You don't seem to want to come back, and it's not because we're going to put you to death, but it is because is there a judgment on the other side of that, and whether that's God coming in or whether the judgment is earlier about there's something that happens to my soul. There is a hardness that comes into me.
That happens even when you're forgiven.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
There is consequence for even forgiven sin.
Yes. And so that hardness, that whatever that is, when I look at the Old Testament as the way Hebrews would say, is it's a shadow of what was to come. I don't have to look at that and go, copy and paste. Someone sins, I get to go kill them. Because that's what Jesus said. Nope, you love your enemies. You pray for those who persecute you. That's your instructions. But if I look at it not, who do I get to kill? If I look at it as, how many times has my heart become hard? And what is going on in my life where I'm grumbling against God and I've decided I don't have to do what he says? That may, in fact, as Ed said, lead me to love God more and love people more, because my sin does keep me from loving God. My sin does keep me from loving other people. But for some reason, we live in this state, I think, a lot as believers of, because I'm forgiven and there's no punishment on the other side of it, I don't got to deal with this other stuff. I can keep loving God and keep my porn problem. I can keep loving people and hold this bitterness in my heart. I can love God and never be generous. I can, you know what I'm saying?
Well, but you don't, just because you don't yet feel the consequence of your own sin does not mean the consequence is not there or it's not coming.
Well, yeah. It's again the part of God is not in a hurry.
Right.
And consequences are also not in a hurry.
Yeah.
Because the book of Hebrews then
they're not immediate. If they were immediate, most people would not. You know, if the first time you got drunk, your wife divorced you, or your kids wouldn't talk to you, or
might be a different deal.
Yeah. If there was the end result of your drunkenness was clear to you the very first time, might change, but that's not the way it is. The first time you hold on to a little something and you don't forgive it.
Yeah.
If you became a bitter old person who was sitting alone complaining about nobody ever coming to see you, you probably wouldn't do it.
Yeah, every person I've ever worked with who's trying to undo or to get rid of for example, a porn habit, porn problem, they had to convince themselves at some point that this is not hurting anybody. But then by the time they get in my office, it is. Yeah. It's not only hurting them, it's probably somebody they love. And now it's here. But up until that point, it wouldn't hurt nobody. Didn't hurt nobody.
And in both of the cases you just mentioned, there's a death associated with it.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you're going to die one way or the other.
Every bit of sin has a little bit of death associated with it. You just don't always see it.
And so there's a potential, once again, to us, they are living in a different culture, as Ed's already pointed out. There is an act of grace when God is saying this person who has now, because they're living also in a very close-knit community where everyone knows what's going on. Everyone sees, because I'll just take the sexual sin of the person who's having sex with an animal. Everyone's like, okay, we see that and that's messed up, right? We know this is going on. The community knows it. And when it goes, we've got to put that to death, other people start to go look at it in the same way that I have been blessed. One of the few blessings I've had as being a pastor's kid and being involved with a lot of people who've had a lot of brokenness in their life was I, at a young age, started looking at a lot of people who I'd realized, the thing that blew up their marriage, man, I got some lust in me right now. The thing that blew up their marriage, his anger, where he can't hold on to it, whatever, that was that example. Though I would never wish that anyone went through that. They did go through it. And the blessing of me being in community and seeing that does say to other people, God, I got to start nipping this in the bud right now. And though we look at it and go, well, that guy shouldn't have had to be put to death, we don't see the grace that is to the rest of the community that goes, let's not even get close to that, because this is serious and this isn't something to mess with. We just live in such an American society, which basically says, whatever you want to do is fine as long as it is moderation. And we ignore.
Or as long as nobody gets hurt.
Sure.
And it ignores the fact somebody is always getting hurt.
Yes.
Even if it's a person doing it.
And I don't know how we overemphasize our own ability to moderate ourselves. Mm-hmm. We think, I'll know when to stop. I'll know when it's gone too far. And in most examples, I mean, we are probably slightly biased because of the people we end up sitting with, because often when people come to a counselor or come to a pastor, things have gotten out of control. So maybe we're slightly biased, but in our experience, no one knows it's gotten out of control until it's caused a death of some kind.
I've never had a man or woman who their spouse made them come talk to me that didn't go, I had no clue.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There's always one of the two that's like, man, I thought we were okay.
Until we weren't.
Until the moment they pointed it out.
That's right.
And so none of this is to say, let's copy and paste the Old Testament, start killing people when they go off, because that's not our place. Yep. But it is also, I think it is important as we're trying to love God and love people more. If this stuff's in the Old Testament, it starts making me go, oh, I can't love God. When I read through it in that way, I do go, man, that is a love. There is love there that I'm not seeing. There is a God who does go in the same way. Once again, I know this is out of fashion now, that a parent might pop a child's hand when they start going to a hot stove to say, this is immediate pain right now, but it is better than the pain that's going to come when you put your hand on that hot stove.
No parent who has a child that's about to step in front of a moving car and grab them and pull them back would feel like they did violence if the kid's elbow came out of socket.
Right.
They would hate the pain.
Yeah, they don't want to do that.
But that pain was way better than letting the car kill them.
Yes. And so when I see that, I go, these are people who are constantly putting themselves in places where death is constantly around them and they don't see it. And God's going, you need to remember this is going to cause your death. If you go too far this direction, it's going to cause your death. And that does line up with teachings of Jesus, though it was not the example, because he did say, it's better for you that a millstone gets put around your neck than that happens to you. It is going to be better on the final day that you turn to me than if you had lived in Sodom and Gomorrah. These are warnings. It's him going, don't get so far down the wrong path that you can't turn back around. And the book of Hebrews would say, quoting from the book of Psalms, while it's still today, you got time today. That to me is loving and hopeful. You have time to turn it around today.
I'm going to say this, and we've already gone too long. The other thing that I wanted to address in this, and if anybody's still listening, it feels to me in this question, I'm probably misreading your intent, which is easy to do in written things, that you think Israel has a special place, and why would God punish them? But I get, what's he trying to show us by punishing these other people? It is a misreading of the Bible to think that God loved Israel more than the other nations. Mm-hmm. That is not what it means by being his chosen people. He chose them for a purpose and a responsibility.
Yep.
Not because they deserved it, not because there was something better about them, and not because when we say chosen, we're like, oh, they're always gonna, no matter what they do.
Yeah.
Hey, God's really clear. Hey, you can break this covenant and all the curses that you dream, they're going to come.
Yeah.
And you don't read much of the Old Testament and realize that the rest of the history of the Jewish people up until today, that has been true.
Yeah.
The curse part of that has been true. And so it really confuses me that people have still kept Israel in this, I don't know, protected place, when that's not the way the covenant was ever set up. And that's all I want to say about that. Mm-hmm. Y'all can ask questions about that. And,
yeah. Maybe we can
nail me on your dispensationalism.
That'll be fine. So, yes, as Ed said, we let this one go a little bit longer because it required a little more nuance.
Yeah.
But I am sure, as with a lot of things like this, we have raised other issues and other questions. And so, as always, links in the description. You can reach out to us, ask us something else, or ask us this again in another way and see if we can get to the question or answer that you're looking for maybe. But either way, thanks for sticking with us for this almost hour-long podcast episode. Wow, look at us. We can do it. I don't know. Maybe we did.
Maybe
we did
should.
something. We
did.
talked.
We talked for 50-something minutes.
We did. So we will see you next time. Send them in if you got more questions, and we'll answer them. Have a good week. See ya.